Put another way, is energy, like electrons are fungible, right? Like you can't really prove that the electrons produced by my solar panels, which took an energy from the sun and like sat in my battery, have then been sold and used by Jason.
The electron is really becoming the most critical commodity of the 21st century. Electricity demand is obviously surging, from AI, from compute, from the electrification of critical industries like transportation and heavy industry, from reshoring of industrial capacity. All these things that we're talking about take tons and tons and tons of electricity.
Definitely today, Helium's design doesn't have a liquidity motor, it's not going to compound that way, but I don't think it's impossible to design a DePIN network that has a liquidity mode and can do sub-DAOs. And I don't think it's 90%, but I think with more experimentation, it'll become more clear that maybe there is something to do there. Maybe it looks more like what Filecoin is doing with virtual machine and like becoming more like a layer one, or maybe it's more like what BitTensor is doing. But I feel the market's like moving in the right direction and going the right way.
Hey guys.
What's up, sir?
Yep.
How we doing?
How you doing?
Good. How are you guys?
Very good.
Well, man.
Just discussing all our crazy plans for the DePIN Summit here in like a month. Are you coming?
I'm still waiting on my my package. I haven't received it yet.
Oh, really? Did you send me your I might have not asked you for your address yet, or I maybe lost it from last year. Or wait, you moved, didn't you? Where do you live now?
No, I'm still here. Same place. You should have it. This is my request for an invite if I don't have one.
You'd be surprised how many of those you got.
I'm sure. That's good. Yeah, I like the hat, Jason.
Appreciate it.
Let's go. I appreciate you being active on Twitter, because we haven't talked in probably a month or two, and it's just easy to go through your feed, see what you've been up to, see what you've been thinking. I like try to tweet a lot too, just like show a little personality. It's almost like character development of a TV show, but it's like you're doing it live for crypto Twitter. What are your views on like being active on Twitter? Do you see like Twitter acts as like a good place to engage? Or like a lot of founders see it as like a waste of time, but I've always found a lot of value in like building in public, putting my thoughts out there, even if sometimes it's like kind of, memes or jokes.
I totally agree. It's one thing that I will start putting more and more of a focus on as we kind of move, to this next stage of our journey. I think it's something I haven't done incredibly well in the past, but something that I think is very valuable. When you look at the world today, it's just all about attention. And, one of the best ways to drive attention as a founder is just to put your thoughts out there. Number one, you can see like what messages are resonating with people. Number two, you just open up the kind of field for people to interact and engage and disagree or agree. And that's really helpful to continue to inform your thinking about where to take things. So I think it's incredibly important for founders to do. And yeah, it's something that I'll certainly be putting a focus on more and more. You're my like permanent hype man, Connor. It's like I can always count on like one like, and it's like my minimum.
Yeah, it's funny. I've gotten that like feedback from other founders too. Like I think how I first got on Frank and Amir's radar is because I was always like the person that liked their tweets. I just feel like a like is like, oh yeah, I like that tweet. Like I liked it. You know what I mean?
Right.
If you think about it from their perspective, like I always pop up on their feed.
Yep.
So they kept seeing my name. And then eventually like they look at my profile, I see I'm tweeting about Helium.
You remember that's how we met. I was starting to work on Daylight in the early days, and I was in Miami and had been following you for a while because you were just loud on Twitter about Helium, way before DePIN was a term, way before a lot of the growth we've seen in the industry and projects. And so I just reached out and we ended up getting, drinks and lunch all because of Twitter. So
Moxie's in Miami. Yeah.
Right.
There's so many like synchronicity, serendipity type moments that happen on Twitter. So glad you're a poster as well. Another thing I wanted to run by you just before we really jump in is like the huge kind of 180 change in US government kind of crypto policy stance positioning that's happened over the last like 6 months, maybe. Like out of all the DePIN founders, I feel like you've always been pretty attuned to like what's going on regulatory wise. I think like even at times it's probably held you guys back a little bit in terms of like the Web3 side of the business. So curious like how you view all these changes, what you're looking forward to in the next 6 months as we get through the election and have a new president, kind of new regime in place.
Totally. Yeah. 2023 was a pretty scary time for the industry. And, a lot of people have already forgotten about it because of the drastic 180 and prices are back up. But, 2023 was really scary. And as a US based team, a US based founder, and someone who had raised capital from a lot of investors that you respect, I felt I owed it to them to not risk the business and make sure that we always did things as closely to what was generally accepted as the best practice as possible. Obviously, everything in crypto is pretty gray, but that's always been kind of a guiding light for me. In 2023, a lot of people who aren't founders don't realize how bad it really was. But Operation Choke Point that Nick Carter and others talked about was very much real. I remember I had an investor, a very large investor in the crypto space and very plugged in. During Operation Choke Point, they went and pulled every major bank in the United States. And they basically asked them, will you accept crypto companies to bank with you? And then will you accept companies that are affiliated with tokens or token issuers to bank with you? There was, in the middle of 2023, I think 8 or 10 banks in the United States that said they would bank crypto companies. And there were 0 that said they would bank companies that were affiliated with tokens, which is pretty crazy and pretty concerning. Think about insurance as well. You know, on our Web2 business, which we'll talk about, you know, on the installation side, like you have to have insurance to cover, you know, the installation work that we're doing. That would be, you know, pretty difficult, if not impossible, to secure in kind of the 2023 timeframe, especially if you don't have a bank account. And so, yeah, it was pretty scary. Regulation by enforcement was pretty widespread. Even if you were able to win your case, a lot of projects just died because they ran out of money defending their cases, right? And so that's not really a playing field that anyone set up to win on. So we quietly waited and watched and continued to build, you know, both our Web2 business and progress our protocol designs throughout 2023. And now we've had the complete 180, and it's clearly, I think, the right time to start scaling the crypto side of this business and for other, you know, teams and projects to really jump back into the crypto space. You know, we have, number one, a complete new organizational structure in the United States. I think a lot of people have missed this, but this is a really big deal. You no longer have to structure as an offshore foundation. The DUNA entity law out of Wyoming is a very, very strong entity protection law. And it's specifically designed with DAOs and DAO governance in mind. And we will likely be structuring as a DUNA out of Wyoming. If anyone's interested in that, you should definitely check out the blog post by Miles at A16Z. He has a really good blog post on why the DUNA is such a big deal for DAOs and for crypto in the United States. And number two, you know, we had a House-passed framework for digital assets. You know, we'll see where that goes in the Senate. But to me, it's very clear that that is like a vote of confidence that we will get some clarity. And if you're a project that's looking to build as closely to, you know, best practices as possible, you can just read the law that was passed by the House and assume that the law, whenever it passes, whether it's this year or next year or in 2 years, will look somewhat similar to that. And so you kind of get an understanding of where regulators and policymakers are thinking about, you know, token networks and how they should look. And then, you know, the last thing, like over the last basically week, crypto is now on a presidential platform listed as like a policy idea. You know, Trump speaking at the Bitcoin 2024 conference, it gets now become a major issue. And so I'm pretty confident we'll get a real framework within the next couple of years that, you know, just frees up so much experimentation in the United States.
Hopefully some regulators eventually listen to this and hear about the innovation that they're unlocking just by the mere like fact of potentially getting a somewhat legal regulatory framework to crypto entrepreneurs. Jason, can you tell us a bit about, like, I think I've learned a ton from you just on the energy industry as a whole and on, you know, a really unique perspective on like first principles on where the industry is going or like the range of possible outcomes of what energy infrastructure in the United States can do or needs to do over the next 5, 10, 20 years. Yeah, curious if you could like share with the audience like your view on high level view on the energy industry and like how that led to Daylight coming about. Yeah,
so to give some context, the electron is really becoming the most critical commodity of the 21st century. Electricity demand is obviously surging, you know, from AI, from compute, from the electrification of critical industries like transportation and heavy industry, from reshoring of industrial capacity. All these things that we're talking about take tons and tons and tons of electricity. What's really interesting is that over the last 20 years, the United States has had basically zero load or electric demand growth. And over the next 10 to 15 years, we're expected to double electricity demand. So we have an entire generation of grid planners, of utility executives who never really had to deal with significant growth in energy demand. And now it's here. And so it's time to start building a system that can handle all of that growth. You know, so we have all this new demand coming online. On the supply side, nearly all of the new generation that's interconnecting is renewable, which is great for climate goals. It's very low cost, but it is unpredictable and intermittent source of energy. And so supply is becoming more difficult to schedule. And so, you know, demand and supply and all these changes that are occurring on the grid are kind of conspiring together to create pretty fragile power grids. And we're starting to see that reflected through, reliability issues. The US has something like 300% more blackouts today than it did in the 1980s when we started first collecting reliability data. I think we lead the developed world in the average, per capita number of minutes without power. So this is a real problem, especially when you start to think about how do we serve all this new demand coming online? Because really the only way to do that is just to scale the grid, at least in the traditional model. So in the traditional kind of model of grid development, you build massive power plants, you interconnect them to the grid, they transport electricity, over miles and miles through the big transmission system. Then it gets stepped down to the distribution system, and then it gets delivered to the end customer. And so if you need to scale that system, number one, you need to build lots of new big centralized generation, which takes years and years to interconnect. There's, 5, 8, 10 plus year long interconnection queues to get those interconnected. Then you need to double the size of the transmission grid, which is probably one of the most impossible things to build in the world today. If you just think about how many jurisdictions transmission crosses, how many municipalities, the NIMBYism, the bureaucracy, the red tape, it's incredibly difficult to build transmission, but we have to do it. And that's really like the path that most people are kind of viewing is how do we meet all this new demand? The problem with that is obviously it's quite difficult, not impossible to do both of those things in the time frame that we need to do. And there's kind of this interesting alternative that presents itself today, which is we can actually rethink about how we build the grid system in more of a decentralized manner. Meaning if we can push generation, energy storage, energy management to the edge of the grid, it actually frees up capacity on the existing grid that allows it to flow, where it's needed. So we're effectively building new capacity by helping move energy generation, energy storage, energy management to the edge of the grid without having to build tons and tons of new centralized infrastructure. And this is great because it offsets, trillions of dollars of transmission capex. Grid planners estimate we need somewhere around 600 billion of annual dollars spent on transmission infrastructure to meet the coming demand. A lot of that can be, effectively collapsed if we can push, generation, storage, and energy management to the edge of the grid. It improves reliability if we can aggregate these assets together, build virtual power plants, and help to effectively manage peak load. That's a significant benefit to grids on the reliability and the balancing side. And so, that's where we are today. And that's kind of the path that we see at Daylight as the most attractive one to build towards, because frankly, it's, number one, cheaper. Number two, it reinforces kind of local resiliency all the way down to the individual level, but also, broadens grid resiliency. Then it just aligns with a system that can meet all of the coming demand, continue to power progress, but do it in a much more efficient way than the traditional centralized model.
Honestly, hadn't thought of it this way before, but it feels like there's a lot of parallels to the wireless industry and the decentralized wireless movement specifically, and like the idea that if you can build out wireless kind of capacity, wireless transfer capacity on the edges of the network versus like AT&T trying to negotiate with a bunch of towers or build a bunch of new towers all across the US. Like there's a lot of like zoning and like real estate costs and hassles that can be avoided in this scenario as well with energy.
Totally. And I think, the interesting piece though, and the reason that we're building Daylight and we're specifically building it the way that we are, is that there's a bit of a market failure or a coordination failure when it comes to distributed energy. What I mean by that is that distributed energy is very valuable. The stuff we just talked about is very valuable in the aggregate, but the individual decision to invest in distributed energy is a very individual one. And so what that leads to is this kind of coordination problem where distributed energy upgrades, they don't really capture all of the societal value that they offer. And so they're more expensive than they should be. They have lower ROIs than they should be because we have this kind of failure to coordinate across all these assets. Interestingly enough, like energy has pioneered movements to solve these market failures using market solutions for decades. We have these, tradable credit schemes that have existed across the energy industry for numbers of years. In the renewable space, we have, renewable energy credits or RECs, which are created to effectively incentivize renewable energy production. Especially in Europe, we have something called white certificates or energy efficiency credits, which are effectively tradable credits for energy efficiency upgrades that really encourage investment decisions in energy efficiency. And so we have kind of a blueprint for how you solve this with these liquid, rights to like a productive outcome, but one doesn't exist for distributed energy today. And so one like good way to think about Daylight and what we're doing is creating a new market solution, a new tradable credit, an energy-backed currency that effectively funds these projects, these electrification upgrades. Those electrification projects connect and contribute some level of flexibility and capacity back to a common protocol. And then energy companies, grid operators, power traders can plug in and redeem those credits, those tokens, that currency for the underlying commodity. And that really solves this market failure by uniting everything to one common platform and one common currency.
Yeah, like you basically have line of sight to the kind of future productive potential earnings of like a solar panel and battery installation from even one homeowner, for instance. So like if you have line of sight to that, you can almost like pull backwards in time those future earnings and future productive potential, and then like use those to discount the investment by a homeowner today to like get a solar panel and a battery installed. And that's like the just making the market more efficient, right? Because you know how to coordinate those resources together in a productive way, whereas like the individual homeowner just can't or won't do that.
You know, if you think about it in terms of energy efficiency credit, you know, the distinction is that those markets have been pioneered by governments. We're pioneering it as a community, which I think is a really interesting and very compelling distinction, but that is the distinction. But in the case of energy efficiency credits, you know, simply, you know, I make an energy efficiency upgrade. I get these white certificates for making energy efficiency improvements and reducing my energy consumption. And now another party in the ecosystem, another company who needs to claim energy efficiency reductions, but can't invest in the technologies like, you know, cost effectively to manage that, could buy those credits from me and use it to claim energy efficiency improvements. So it effectively creates this market around energy reductions, and the market kind of settles to the lowest cost of energy reductions. It's the same thing in the Daylight protocol. Users are issued tokens for delivering some level of distributed energy capacity, and then companies and organizations and operators and traders that need that capacity can redeem it. And so it's a pretty interesting analogy.
What does it mean to contribute flexible energy capacity? Meaning, like, we're talking about solar and batteries here, but you know, I think those are not the only two ways to contribute to the network. Or so how do you expect like that everyday user to be part of Daylight?
Yeah, it's pretty seamless. We have somewhere around 90 or 95% coverage in software integrations with nearly every distributed energy resource on the market today. Many of them will be live when we launch our testnet, which I think will be live by the time we launch this podcast. Others will be, you know, in testing and will be rolling out. We have a great partner that we work with to help, prioritize these different distributed energy integrations. That means really any internet connected device that produces, manages, or, you know, stores energy can connect to the platform and offer capacity. It's pretty simple. You'll download the Daylight app. You'll connect those devices very much like a Plaid interface. You just put in your credentials for those devices. You connect them to the platform. And then our app actually allows you to manage and control all of those devices in one spot. So you no longer need to have a Nest app and a Tesla app and a Franklin app. Like, everything can be managed directly in the Daylight app. And we have, for every device, a specific type of contribution called a flexibility contribution, which allows the user to delegate some level of flexible capacity to the protocol. So in the case of a thermostat, you can go and slide and say, hey, I want to give the protocol 3 degrees of flexibility over this thermostat. Or in a battery, I want to make sure I reserve 50% of my battery at all times, but the other 50% can be used by the protocol when needed. And so it's totally up to the user how much they contribute. Whether that's a little or a lot. Rewards will be based on really how much flexible capacity you're providing. And yeah, that's how it works. So it's very user driven. What we don't want is this kind of like PvP ecosystem where it's like Daylight just comes in and cranks your thermostat up 15 degrees when you're not paying attention. Like, that's not a way to build a really robust and engaging ecosystem, I don't think.
No, that makes sense. You want kind of customer opt-in, buy-in. But yeah, before we get too deep into Daylight, I just want to rewind us a little bit and talk about how the company was first called React, right? So I think that's like the DePIN OGs would know the company as React, and then obviously rebranded to Daylight. So tell us a bit about maybe that rebrand, building Daylight through the bear market, and then your recent round as well. Would love to hear about that.
Yeah, so we founded, what is now Daylight in 2022 with a vision, pre-DePIN, TIPIN, even if anyone remembers like the TIPIN term. It was, at a time when there was really no interest from traditional crypto investors in this space. We were effectively pitching, Helium for energy, got turned down by many, many investors, but found many investors that were also very excited about the vision, raised a seed round and got to work building what at the time was called React. Funny little story about, just our lore, but React was never going to be the name until the last day we had to pick a name with our branding agency, which by the way is like, founder mistake number one as a first-time founder is never work with a branding agency. They're terrible. But we were working with a branding agency and we had a name picked. And literally the day before everything had to be finalized, we found out there was a trademark issue with the original name. And so we had to pick a name and like 4 hours. And so React was picked. We moved on and launched the project. As we started to move towards testnet after we had been building kind of the protocol for a while, we just ran into, I think, a number of issues that made us decide, now is not the right time to launch the protocol. Number one, of course, was, all of the stuff we talked about in 2023. Post FTX, there wasn't a ton, crypto is not a very attractive space to consumers. There was the regulatory concerns, there was the infrastructure concerns around banking and insurance. And, other things happened. Our meter manufacturer effectively closed down their residential unit. And so we lost support for the meters we were working with. And we just decided, this isn't the right time. We know we can't launch a token right now. And so we are going to build a business that will support the core team, will support the protocol when we can launch it, and will really be one of the key pieces of our ecosystem moving forward to ensure that our vision can come to fruition. And so if you think about, distributed energy today, we talked a bit about that market failure that we're solving with, what we call the world's first energy-backed currency, currency redeemable for energy capacity. But the other, difficulty here is that it's just a very fragmented local market today that's very difficult to navigate. The majority of installers are, small local businesses. They provide one very specific point solution. So you have an insulation guy, you've got a solar guy, you've got the HVAC guy, you've got the guy that does EV chargers. They don't communicate. They don't plan around other upgrades. And it's just a pretty broken process. And if you look at it from a traditional Web 2 investment model, there's a really big opportunity to just go standardize and simplify that process to make distributed energy and electrification projects much, much easier for people to access. And so that's what we did. The Daylight Marketplace, which is really going to be the first application built on the protocol, which is pretty interesting. The Daylight Marketplace standardizes distributed energy and electrification products, prices, and procurement. So we do procurement, we do engineering and design. We pick the products we think are best in the market. We help design full home and small business electrification upgrades for users. And then we connect them with vetted local contractors who will do the permitting and actual installation. We procure the hardware so we can do it at a national level and get economies of scale. The equipment's installed by our local installation partners. And so we really collapse the funnel into one central management hub in this managed marketplace of the Daylight Marketplace. We've been electrifying homes in the Northeast. It's been going, really well. We're doing on average 2 jobs per home, which is pretty exciting. It kind of reinforces the vision that electrification is a system and not a specific upgrade. And yeah, that's what we've been up to on the Web 2 side. As we got through the end of 2023 and the regulatory wind started to shift, it became clear that the protocol is becoming more and more viable, and we're more and more comfortable launching the token and starting to really scale the broader ecosystem. And so in early 2024, this year, we kicked off a fundraise. We closed a round led by Andreessen Horowitz and A16Z Crypto, joined by the team at Framework Ventures and existing investors, Lattice, Layer Hippo, and of course, Escape Velocity. So we're pumped about that round. We have amazing partners who think very critically and very deeply about crypto economics, about protocol design, and combine that with our team's background in energy, our power trading experience, our grid operations experience, our energy investment experience. And, now I think is the time to go and launch the broader ecosystem, which we're incredibly excited about. And that means that the project will not just be launching with a token and an app, but with a full service electrification marketplace that can really reinforce the growth of the network itself. As we make parallels and analogies to Helium, I think one thing to call out is, things are similar, but things are very different. And I think the deployer model is very different than it is in, say, Helium, because these upgrades have to be made by master electricians, licensed businesses with insurance. This is not something that you can spin up a deployer business and just start, deploying this equipment into people's homes or people's buildings. Much more difficult than that. And so the Daylight Marketplace is very specifically built to grow the ecosystem very rapidly and ensure that, these upgrades are as accessible and low cost and simple as possible for potential users of the protocol.
On that note, real quick, I definitely think we do need some master electricians helping out with installations, because I remember I was beta testing one of your earliest smart meters, the Emporia smart meter. And I was you basically put it in I don't know what it's called, the electricity switchboard in your apartment.
Yeah,
you open
electric
the panel,
the
breaker panel. But you even had to take the face of the breaker panel off and connect to wires on the back end. And I just remember messaging Jason a million times, can I touch this with this, or am I gonna like shock myself and die? So yeah, it'll make sense to have from like a safety perspective and just from like an ease and like ease of mind type setup, just to have homeowners like work with someone kind of vetted
Totally.
or verified to get that set up.
And the cool thing too is the new meter that we are working on right now, and will be the first meter that we sell, is actually much simpler to install. So what's cool is those original meters and most of the meters on the market today, like Sense, like Emporia, have to be wired to a power source, which is typically an open breaker or an existing breaker. The design that we are working on right now is effectively a self-powered design where it uses the current itself through induction to power itself. So it's much, much, much simpler to install. Yeah, pretty excited about that.
The Daylight marketplace, when I think about the Daylight protocol, you guys have two sides to the marketplace, right? The supply side is mainly retail. It's folks who are contributing their individual energy capacity. And then you have traders and installers and this ecosystem of like businesses on the other side. I think like you're one of the most pragmatic entrepreneurs that I've met in how you think about energy. We at EV3 have looked at a lot of companies with this picture on like peer-to-peer energy, like actually, just like retail on both sides of the marketplace. And why can't we do this with zero middleman at all? What do you think about that? Like, do you think there's any ideas in that space worth trying, or what's the most exciting one you've seen? What's your overall take?
Yeah, and Connor commented on a tweet, speaking of tweets earlier, that I made earlier on peer-to-peer energy. I'm generally bearish. There's a joke in venture, right? Like of how the world's littered with like dead CRM startups, right? And like in energy, it's the same thing with peer-to-peer startups. I think it's something that sounds really good, especially if you have a background in IoT or finance. It sounds exciting. But there's, I think, a reason why a lot of people with backgrounds in power markets haven't really pursued these ideas. First, like I'll just start with, in almost every, if not every major market in the world, it is not allowed, like specifically by regulation. So there's no path to actually launching a peer-to-peer marketplace in really any power market today, because it is so different and has so many complicated side effects for existing market and regulatory structures. So it's really not something that you can do, even if you build a really interesting platform to facilitate it. And I think that's like number one, like the most important thing to know is that it's just not allowed. And if you're building a startup, betting your entire startup on, getting significant regulatory and market structure changes in some of the slowest moving markets in the world is a very, very difficult pitch to make. Number two, it actually just like isn't, like peer-to-peer energy is not a thing because of physics, meaning electrons just travel along the path of least resistance. Like a good analogy is to think about electrons flowing through wires, like water flowing through a pipe. Water flowing through a pipe just goes to where the faucet's open. You can't specifically move this molecule of water to this person's house through the pipe. It just flows along the path of least resistance. And electricity is the same thing. And so unless we are running like cables specifically between, my house and your house, Connor, there's no way for me to actually direct specific electrons to your home. So there is no physical peer-to-peer market. It's just not how electricity works from a pure physics perspective. And so when people talk about peer-to-peer energy, they're really only talking about kind of like financial settlements between peers. But there's tons of financial complexity behind the scenes in how power markets work. Like for instance, who bears the risk if the power that you say you're going to deliver to me through this financial market is not actually delivered? In power markets today, with energy retailers, we have tons of like credit lock boxes, collateral, like we have a whole system to facilitate what happens and who bears risk. That's a big open question. If you were to do this financially, like who bears that risk? Who do you procure power from if the counterparty like fails to deliver the power that they say they're going to deliver? Maybe you just pull together a bunch of, capacity for a bunch of people, and then you just clear that pooled power to a general market for buyers. Well, great. You just invented virtual power plants. So there's just, I think it's kind of just a hand wavy space that people get excited about, but one that's not very practical, and one that like probably, even if you were to figure out a way to implement very local peer-to-peer energy markets, just very limited benefits in general compared to a traditional wholesale market model that exists in most power markets today. I think like the caveat is microgrids, but they aren't really like trading power economically. They're just balancing a grid based on all the assets connected to a microgrid typically. So yeah, that's kind of my thoughts around peer-to-peer.
Is there anything that would change your mind? I guess we have like software-defined radios now. We can like beam bandwidth places, why can't we have software defined lasers beam energy from your house to Connor's house someday?
I mean, like, if we have like breakthroughs in physics, like, yeah, we can revisit market structures. But until then, yeah.
Fair.
Yeah, bearish P2P energy makes sense. I think, like, put another way, is energy, like electrons are fungible, right? Like, you can't really prove that the electrons produced by my solar panels, which took an energy from the sun and like sat in my battery, have then been sold and used by Jason.
It's all fun. Yeah, it's all financial, right? So it's like contract for difference and swaps, and it would just be basically a financial market, and you need like a settlement authority to manage that, but it's complicated.
What did you think of the Helium network of DePIN networks announcement and the Sourceful HIP? So we just did an episode with them. I don't know if you've gotten a chance to like look at that HIP or know much about it, but curious what you think of like an energy DePIN trying to build virtual power plants launching under the Helium kind of sub-DAO umbrella versus launching on their own. Like, how would you think about the pros and cons of pledging fealty to Helium versus claiming your sovereignty and launching on your own?
Yeah, I won't talk specifically about Sourceful. I think, one of my favorite business quotes, I think it was the CEO of Visa, said, my competition isn't MasterCard, it's cash and checks. And that's how I think about the space today. Like, my competition isn't other people attempting to build distributed energy networks. It's everybody that's just buying all of their power from the utility. And so I'm excited for Sourceful. I hope they're successful and wish those guys luck. I know how difficult energy is. It's, frankly, in my opinion, an order of magnitude more difficult than wireless. I'm excited to see what they bring to the table. I think specifically we talked about the Helium sub-DAO structure, and I love Helium. It was really the project that brought me into the space and gave me a lot of inspiration for Daylight. I do think the sub-DAO model, like thinking about it from a founder's perspective, is a bit flawed. And the reason I say that is DePIN is not DeFi. And so if you think about like sub-DAO models, it makes a little bit of sense in DeFi. Like, look at Maker. Maker has tons of liquidity, but individual applications around that liquidity have their own risk parameters, have their own methods for allocation. And so that's a really interesting sub-DAO model where you have this central hub for liquidity, and then projects and the core team can spin up these sub-DAOs that have their own risk parameters, have their own underwriting standards, have their own mechanisms to use that liquidity and get yield in that liquidity. That makes sense. To build a sub-DAO there, you are tapping into tons and tons of liquidity. But DePIN is different. And so when you think about what can a central DePIN hub offer you as a project, I'm not really sure what there is to offer outside of maybe brand value and early community, which is very little if you're giving up 90% of your protocol economics to a central hub. You look at Demo, you look at HiveMapper, I don't think they've really had a problem building a community, on their own. I think they've done an incredible job of catalyzing community. And I think that's something that crypto projects are really good at doing, is catalyzing community. And so if you are a project studying the market and saying, I want to launch, for instance, an energy network, what can Helium offer me in return? Again, back to the deployer thing we just talked about, the deployer model is very different than the wireless deployer model. The community exists, but can we access that community through other channels? And is it worth giving up 90% of my protocol economics to H&T holders if I launch my platform there? And then you continue down that thought process, and maybe we decide, okay, we're going to go tap into that community. We're going to go build our project. We get some initial success, but 90% of my protocol value is flowing directly to H&T holders, of which I hold almost none. Even like, let's be generous, maybe that collapses down to 15 or 20%. Regardless, there's a take by H&T holders, and they're not really giving me anything at this point. Why would I not fork away? I mean, you totally should fork away. Multi-coin guys talk about this all the time about L2s, right? And if they're talking about L2s, it's the same thing with sub-DAOs. There's no reason to pledge fealty to H&T holders, of which, again, I own none, because, they gave me an initial boost around my community. So there's not this like liquidity mode that exists in DeFi and DePIN. And so I'm not really sure how the structure will work, except for Helium Foundation and Nova Labs internally developed sub-DAOs that are aligned because they're being led by large holders of H&T.
I think you're thinking about it the right way. It's like, what are the pros and cons of launching as a sub-DAO versus launching on your own? I mean, one thing I think that might weigh on like the positive side that I think you covered maybe briefly, but it's like almost a second order effect, is like if the energy sub-DAO can get off the ground and really generate some meaningful on-chain revenue, then they can receive a potentially significant amount of H&T emissions to their sub-DAO treasury that they can then choose what to do with. And that's where I pushed back on a buy. And I mean, not even pushed back because they were thinking along the same lines, but the Sub-DAO utility score that determines how much HNT flows to which Sub-DAO needs to be amended.
Totally.
So it's not just about data transfer revenue, it's about on-chain revenue in general. But it sounds like they're willing to do that. And, I guess we'll just see how things go. I was pretty initially surprised to see like 80-90% of like energy Sub-DAO revenue is going to accrue to HNT versus their own token. But maybe that's what you need to do to get off the ground.
Yeah, I'm excited to see the experiment, right? One thing that I talk about all the time is more experimentation in token economics. And so I'm really excited to see this experimentation. That's just my reflection as someone who's thought, about it pretty deeply. I'm not sure, like, if we're making a parallel, what the liquidity moat is to a DePIN hub.
I would take a little bit of the other side of the argument. Definitely today, Helium's design doesn't have a liquidity moat or is not going to compound that way, but I don't think it's impossible to design a DePIN network that has a liquidity moat and can do sub-DAOs. And I don't think it's 90%, but yeah, I don't know. I think with more experimentation, it'll become more clear that maybe there is something to do there. Maybe it looks more like what Filecoin's doing with virtual machine and like becoming more like a layer one, or maybe it's more like what BitTensor's doing. But I feel the market's like moving in the right direction and going the right way.
Totally. And that's just my point there is a reflection on the current state. And I totally expect it to evolve and change as experimentation turns into practice and we get to see how these things evolve.
Speaking of how far ideas can evolve, we've been working really, really hard on this like medallion structure with the two of us, which was inspired by you. And I think inspired originally like in a funny way by something SBF did with Serum back in the day, where he tried to create this protocol called Mega Serum, which effectively you would lock up 1 million or 100, I think it was 1 million Serum tokens. Yeah. And it would create 1 Mega Serum. There were up to 1,000 Mega Serum. People that held Mega Serum had like highly discounted fees, or maybe they had no fees on the exchange. And so, for a hot minute there, meaning like a handful of weeks, I think like there was this like mad dash to get medallions from folks who were like trading really aggressively on FTX before it all sort of like collapsed. And we all know the rest of the story. But this idea of locking native tokens for like a super economic right to like the capacity of whatever the underlying network is, I think is actually really smart and inspired this Medallions idea, which I think of as separate the like peak of separating governance and economic rights in protocols. I think those two things should not be mixed together is what we've learned, or they should be extremely thoughtfully embedded through like veto rights and through soft forks or something else, but not like, I just think token voting is like literally cancerous to all of crypto. And so, yeah, tell us a bit about the Medallions like model. You're the one that really came up with it. So how did it come about? How is Daylight implementing it? I'm like, how do you hope it differs or makes Daylight different than like what's out there today in DePIN?
Yeah, so there's kind of a number of reasons and thought that went into it. Number one, like it feels like over the last like year and a half, like there's just been less experimentation around token design, which I think is kind of bearish. Like there should always be really interesting experimentation.
Except how short you can make the lockups. That's the only experimentation that we've seen.
Right, exactly. And so the inspiration for me actually came from like taxi medallions. And I know that's an analogy that's been made before, but I found this really cool report around effectively this like private equity fund that was investing specifically in taxi medallions and how the taxi medallion market worked. But if you think about taxi medallions, they're effectively like a claim on the underlying commodity, which is the ability to drive a taxi on the road, right? And if you want to drive a taxi on the road, you have to either own a medallion or you have to lease a medallion from someone who owns them. And once you have that medallion, you can drive the car. You think about this in terms of energy capacity. You can either price energy capacity, which you guys spoke with the Sourceful guys, and I thought they were very thoughtful about this. Like, where do you price energy capacity? Do you price it at the market? Do you do it at a fixed rate and try to undercut the market? Like, where do you price things? And so you can do it in kind of this buy and burn model, or you can have what I think is an interesting idea, effectively medallions that are minted by locking up tokens. And that medallion gives you a fixed amount of energy capacity in whatever region you point it to. And what's really interesting about this is it pushes what I'll call like the operational complexity to the edge of the network, meaning the network doesn't have to worry about prices. All they have to worry about is engaging energy companies, energy retailers, power traders to come and use that infrastructure. And those companies can come in and they can monetize it however they want. All they need is a license to that underlying energy capacity. So if a retailer wants to use it to bring new customers on their book and have an internal hedge, that's kind of an internalized benefit They need the license to do that. But from a network perspective, it's very difficult to price that transaction. Takes a lot of operational overhead to do so. If you just have a license, that retailer can come in, it can bid for those customers with a license, and then it can use all that capacity as a physical hedge for itself and help reduce its exposure to the wholesale market. Similarly, a power trader can come in and for 6 months over the summer, access all the underlying energy capacity by locking up tokens, and it can monetize that against its trading strategy however it wants. And it takes the risk and it takes the alpha, but it takes the risk and decides how it wants to monetize that capacity. So I think it's just a way to simplify like the operational overhead to some extent by saying, we aren't going to attempt to price things. You're just going to come in and you get to decide how much energy capacity you want in each region. And you just need to hold the license or the medallion for that region in order to access it. And the rest is up to you.
One thing that we've been talking about in conjunction with the Medallions piece is this like meme of FDV that I think we have similar views on. Just fundamentally, if you're building a network that you expect to perpetually like exist and it goes through these investment cycles that, like you were just talking about, we had 20 years of like no energy demand growth in the US. And now we're going to, over the next 10 years, maybe grow it, we're going to double. So it's going to, hit like a mid-teens CAGR. Those are fundamentally different investment cycles if you're a network on how many tokens you want to issue, on where you want to issue them. And so this idea of just like fixed inflation or like halvings, like what Bitcoin has, fundamentally, I think doesn't work for networks that are allocating capital in the real world. How do you think the Daylight network, understanding it's not launched yet and a lot will be up to the folks who are storing the protocol and the community over time, but how do you expect the Daylight networks look like from an inflation perspective long term?
Yeah, I don't want to dive too deep into our token economics because it's not public and still a work in progress, but happy to share kind of like my thoughts in general. I think in general, and I tweet about this, it's certainly no secret that I think, in most protocols, fixed supplies are kind of a negative. They're a bit of a meme. I think it's frankly a holdover from Bitcoin and kind of its influence on the space that everything needs to be supply capped. But you would never, ever launch a company on day one and say, this is the total amount of shares we can ever issue in the company. It would hinder your growth long term. The problem is not necessarily like an uncapped number of units floating around. It's just how efficiently those units are allocated. And are they productive? Is it productive inflation or is it, unproductive inflation? And so when you look at things like Hivemapper and even going back further, Filecoin, they have really interesting, token issue models that actually reward kind of underlying growth in the useful service of the network itself rather than just a pure time-based inflation schedule. And I think that ensures to some degree that inflation of the token supply is coming from productive inflation and not just unproductive inflation. So I think uncapped token supplies will start to become more common. We'll start to see those. There's actually a really, really interesting proposal in the Filecoin ecosystem right now to uncap their token supply. And I think that's something that, will be part of kind of this next generation of DePINs, next generation of token design, projects that aren't afraid to experiment with uncapped supplies as long as they're done in a very useful way. I think one of the problems with cap supplies to some extent too, Sal, is the FDV meme that you were kind of talking about. If you're like an app on a chain somewhere and you kind of have like a token that's just this kind of like governance token, right? Like I don't want to use anybody's like specifically, but you just have a governance token that's not rewarding any kind of unique coordination. It's just a governance token that you launch for liquidity. Then I think FDV is like a really important metric to watch because those new tokens coming on the market aren't really rewarding any kind of useful growth in the network itself. Typically, they're just inflation for inflation's sake. In the case of these DePIN networks, especially if they're designed, well, inflation is rewarding underlying growth in the network itself. And so anchoring like today's like total value to like what the future number of units looks like is kind of like a weird comparison to make. It would be like saying, in my opinion, like, here is the earnings per share today, but like we're going to assume there's no growth in earnings per share, but the company doubles their share count over the next 5 years. Like that would be like a really poor comparison to make because a company likely wouldn't make that decision. And so that's kind of how I think about FDVs around DePINs is they're kind of not real. And so if we move away from these like hard cap supplies, we can stop anchoring to these silly FDVs and think more about, what is the long-term growth of the key metrics and what does that look like today, 1-2 years from now, not in 15 years when all these tokens are issued and run out.
Yeah, well, I agree with you. I also think goes back to the conversation we were having earlier on protocol design, meaning these networks, like you can either uncap the supply like Filecoin is doing, or you can do like the Bitsensor and Helium strategy of like issue multiple tokens, right? And like become the sub-DAO model. It's like hidden inflation. Like
it's inflation. It's just
yeah, it's semi-hidden though. It makes it more flexible in the sense that like we don't know what the value accrual between Helium and mobile or HNC and mobile tokens are going to be on day one, and we like governance in the market sort of like figure those things out over time. But I agree, certainly inflation is just one of those paths will turn out probably to be the right one. Either do the Filecoin thing and have one token but uncap the supply and figure out the dynamics of issuance, or stay true to like the fixed supply, like our asset is going to be money and that has to have a cap supply type of like mentality and philosophy, but then just create a shit ton of new tokens. Or once you create a couple of new ones, I guess like sort of becomes inevitable that you issue a shit ton of a nearly infinite number of tokens over a long enough time period.
Yep.
If you weren't doing medallions, what's like the craziest tokenomics idea that you considered for? I know it's not set in stone yet, but maybe one that you like have you definitely won't do, but you considered at some point in time or were inspired by. What's the most off the wall idea?
Off the wall idea. Another like just like philosophical reason for uncapped supply tokens is I think in these useful networks, it's probably unfair to assume that if somebody like mines a bunch of tokens in year one and then stops contributing, that they should be able to sit on a huge portion of the supply in perpetuity. I think that's actually something that's not talked about. But what I call like contribution through time should be rewarded. And so if you're a passive user that was very active in year one and not active in year 2 through 10, you should probably have a lot of your stake inflated. And so one of the things, this is never seriously considered, but like the Art Gobblers design that Paradigm put out, I think is a super wacky design for DePINs. You just have this like perpetually increasing token inflation. And the only way to like continue to hold on to your percent stake in the network is to ensure that you're a constant participator, or else like you get dwarfed by inflation like pretty rapidly. I think that's like a really interesting experiment. Certainly one that we're not going to run, but that would probably be like my wackiest idea.
That's funny.
For DePIN.
Energy gobblers.
Yeah. We absolutely don't need that.
I like that would create mental stress for me if I was a contributor.
Totally.
Right. I mean, that's the point though, but it's like, I have to keep contributing.
Yep.
Or else all my tokens are going to go away.
Yep.
Cool. Well, I know we're almost at time. There's just like one or two quick kind of fun questions we have at the end here. You said on Twitter, specialization is for insects. So why is that?
The most interesting people in the world are the ones that I think like have really significant interests and curiosities and things maybe outside of like their core competency. And you look at like some of like the world's, greatest people, Thomas Edison, Teddy Roosevelt, Elon Musk, like they're all very cross-dimensional and they understand lots of things very deeply. And I think like, unfortunately, like our education system today and just like our kind of societal structures often force people into thinking that they can only understand one thing deeply. And I just don't think that's the case. DePIN networks are inherently like very cross-functional. You need to understand economics. You need to understand the industry you're working in. You need to understand software design, protocol design. And so you need to understand hardware. And so I think it's like reflecting on DePIN every day has just reinforced my opinions that you can really learn anything you want if you set your mind to it. And, the best way to set yourself up for success and expand kind of your opportunity for luck is to just continually be curious and learn and not close yourself off from any domain because you feel like it's outside of your core competency.
I'll jump in. What's your favorite? What meme coin are you buying? Mobile or Mother?
I'm not a meme coin guy. I'll be honest. I kind of fall on the anti-meme coin train on Twitter. I think like the scene coin thing is pretty interesting. And so like these meme coins that are like actually becoming ingrained in communities. And so, Degen, I think is like with Farcaster is like the clear example, right? Where it's kind of becoming ingrained in the Farcaster ecosystem. So if I was going to go buy a meme coin, it'd probably be one of these ones that like actually has potential for like value accrual and not just like pump and dump mechanics. I'm not going to specialize in meme coin stuff. That's for sure. We're talking about specialization.
Fair. Yeah.
I don't have enough time to study charts.
For sure.
When the token issuer looks like Iggy, I make time.
Yeah.
We'll find you some more of those, Sal. Cool, guys. Well, I know we're over time, so let's wrap it here. Unless Jason, there's anything else you want to add, but I think we covered a lot. So really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, guys. I think at the time that we launch this, the testnet will be live and we'll have announced the round. So I encourage everyone to download the Daylight app, connect an energy device, start earning points, and follow us on Twitter. We'd love to have everybody join in and start to really experiment and make our testnet successful and our mainnet successful.
Thanks for listening to the Proof of Coverage podcast. We'll be posting one new episode a week on Mondays, interviewing the best DePIN and crypto founders out there. If you like this episode, please follow us on Twitter or X at CoverageProved or on any major podcasting platform. Thank you.